Hi, everyone. I'm Guy Wuollet, and I work at Andreessen Horowitz on the investing team. And today I'm going to talk about how Ethereum and Cosmos' roadmaps are coming together, and great minds think alike. Before I start, I have to say that none of this is legal, tax, investment, or business advice. These are just my opinions, and some of them are probably wrong, so if you disagree, I'd love to argue with you afterwards. The impetus for this talk was a tweet that I had published a while ago about how Cosmos and rollup-centric Ethereum are both pushing towards the same direction. And as I was putting these slides together and doing some research, I realized that about 2 years ago, Mustafa had said the same thing, which is going to be a recurring theme throughout this talk, that he and people in Cosmos generally are both early and correct. I don't think the video is going to work. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I think highlights the point I want to make during this talk, that it's often very possible to be intellectually correct but not end up winning, or not end up making the right tangible impact in the world. And the way Peter Thiel phrases this is that there's something good and bad about libertarians. The good part is that generally they're right, and the bad part is that generally they lose. And I think Cosmos is in the tenuous position of perhaps veering a bit towards this direction, and I hope it can end up winning. Another good demonstration of this, I think, is John Charbonneau, who's one of the partners at DBA, had an excellent tweet saying that Cosmos is not serious people, similar to the common succession meme, meant in the best way of there are a lot of admirable ideas, but they have not been implemented as well as they possibly could. I think one other interesting analogy here is to consider former projects that had a similar characteristic, things like Xerox PARC, which had invented the GUI and Ethernet amongst a long list of other things, and General Magic, which basically built an iPhone in the mid-90s and was simply a bit too early for its time. Cosmos has a very strong community, and I think an event like this is demonstrating that, is almost an epitome of it. And amongst the top 5 ecosystems, this is Electric Capital's developer report. It's the only ecosystem that hasn't lost developers in the last year. At the same time, usually Cosmos chains lack or lag in adoption compared with some of the other ecosystems on the screen. So I personally was a bit skeptical of the ideas that had founded Cosmos, and I have, I think, been proven wrong over the last several years. First, I didn't think that there were that many benefits from customizing the logic of the virtual machine and inserting application-specific logic in consensus. And I think this has been proven wrong. Osmosis has done an excellent job adding threshold encryption and has proven that approaches like that are almost essential for internalizing MEV amongst DeFi projects. And I think a really important other characteristic here is the ability to improve UX. And this is demonstrated, I think, quite well even outside of Cosmos with the adoption of account abstraction across L2s and different EVM chains. The second was that I had thought that Cosmos chains usually are sacrificing decentralization for scale, which is a perfectly valid thing to do, but often not what projects explicitly say. And I think the thing that I had missed is that validity proofs, the ability to execute computation off-chain and prove it on-chain, will help break the scalability trilemma. And there's nothing inherent to a rollup-centric roadmap for scaling that actually is better than multiple L1s as a scaling approach. And the third one, I still believe this to some extent. I think atomic composability, especially for DeFi projects, is very important. And again, I think this can be solved with validity proofs and shared sequencing, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's nothing about the existing Cosmos architecture that can't be upgraded to fulfill this vision. And I think there are a number of similarities. I'll go through one at a time between Cosmos and Ethereum today. The first being that there are a number of different SDK frameworks that I think are all inspired by Cosmos SDK being deployed on top of Ethereum today. So you have obviously things like OP Stack and ZK Stack as forks of Optimism and ZK Sync. You also see things like sovereign rollups being pioneered by Celestia, which in some sense is an extension of Cosmos. And I think the important similarities to highlight are that in each of these cases you've had an SDK for deploying a chain, a rollup, whatever you want to call it, before you've had true interoperability. So in Cosmos Stargate, the upgrade that enabled IBC cross-chain launched well after the Cosmos SDK was available to developers. And I think this pushed the ecosystem in a direction of having lots of chains launch mostly as full stack or verticalized applications that themselves could support the full sort of end-to-end user experience, instead of what I think is potentially quite interesting approach, having gains from specialization, where each chain takes a very limited and constrained approach to doing one thing very well and not needing to offer all of the other services. I think another important point to make here is that both Cosmos and Ethereum L2s are basically scaling through implicit sharding. And what I mean by implicit sharding is that you had a lot of proposals for L1s, either Ethereum. I think Near is perhaps the best example of an actually sharded chain, a dynamically sharded chain, that were not well adapted and did not end up receiving as much end usage as I would have expected. And I think part of the reason implicit sharding has won is that it's emergent, that developers can make the trade-off themselves between decentralization and scale and choose the amount of security that's relevant for them. Any other points to make here? No, I think that's about right. The next point I would make is that I think Ethereum's current roadmap of dank sharding, of EIP 4844, creating blob storage, and then even the original rollup-centric roadmap for Ethereum, I think is almost has to be in some sense inspired by the work that Celestia and Mustafa have done, originally with Lazy Ledger, renamed to Celestia, and now focused on sovereign rollups. And I think perhaps Celestia and Cosmos are made one and the same too often, but I think almost certainly you'd have to say that his ideas have influenced the direction of the ecosystem and have really pushed the whole space in this direction. And I am quite excited to see Celestia launch. I think it will be an interesting question whether or not Celestia reaches its full form before dank sharding and EIP 44 launch properly on Ethereum. And then I think the final comparison would be, there's a lot of talk about eigenlayer and restaking on Ethereum, and this is actually very similar to the ideas of mesh security and interchain security posited by Cosmos. Both of these, I think, are perhaps very beneficial for the underlying ecosystems and chains, where if you're a fan of restaking for rollups and for new chains on Ethereum, then that would make you much more positive about Ethereum, I would guess, and the same going for the Cosmos Hub or Osmosis and other chains that are sort of at the nexus of connection in the Cosmos ecosystem. I think there are a couple of important differences between Cosmos and Ethereum, and where the roadmaps have not converged to the same extent that I would have expected. Ethereum L2s all seem to be moving towards using validity proofs. Even the existing optimistic rollups, Kelvin from Optimism has talked about eventually upgrading there, and I would expect Arbitrum to do the same. This, I think, is fairly different from Cosmos chains continuing to rely on proof-of-stake economic guarantees. And I would anticipate, or I would hope, that more folks in Cosmos focus on what I think is probably the unique characteristic of zero-knowledge rollups on Ethereum, namely being a validity proof-based bridge. The second point I would make is that I think there are a lot of things that Cosmos has implemented or is in the process of implementing that has been adopted by other ecosystems and hopefully will be used here first. A couple examples of this are threshold encryption from Osmosis. Intense has become a very hot topic, and it seems like people enjoy it because they can graft whatever preconceptions they have about the world onto the idea. And Anoma, at least that I'm aware of, was the first project to really talk about this and mainstream it. And then a lot of the discussion around shared sequencing and atomic composability between L2s on Ethereum, I think, echoes quite similarly to what Skip is doing, using economic finality for cross-domain, or in this case, cross-Cosmos chain finality. And I think an important question is which ecosystem can implement many of these ideas that seem objectively good. That's just my opinion, but these ideas that seem objectively good faster, and actually integrate them into the applications that users are participating in every day. And so I think, why would you build on Cosmos in the past couple of years? The answers were, one, better performance. If you wanted to launch a proof-of-stake blockchain, perhaps Cosmos SDK was actually the best approach to doing so, the simplest and the quickest to launch. You could customize the virtual machine, and importantly, I think a lot of DeFi chains have focused on different versions of making making that logic much more efficient or resistant to MEV and internalizing it. And then I think, and I hope this becomes more true, you get seamless interoperability and more chains are specializing on specific primitives that are composed well with each other. But a lot of this is being replicated by other ecosystems. And so I think there's an open question of where will Cosmos focus in the future. And these are at least my opinions on what I think some interesting directions would be. The first being simplicity. The discussion around rollups on Ethereum, or even to some extent sovereign rollups from Celestia, is very complex. And it's almost a full-time job to try and stay up to date with what has happened there. If you're simply a developer who wants to build an application and thinks, an app chain will replace a smart contract in the future, this whole process has to become drastically simpler. And I think Cosmos is perhaps quite well prepared to do this because they can specialize in very specific areas as opposed to needing to build the full stack themselves. The second being validity proofs. I would be quite excited to see more chains and projects focus on using ZK, for lack of a better word. And I think a lot of Cosmos projects are actually fairly well positioned to take advantage of this. Zawa is a ZK proving system for WASM, and then RISC-0 has implemented a ZK proof system for RISC-V. I think there are a lot of projects that have built the infrastructure to enable what I would like to see, and it's simply sort of a matter at this point of continuing to improve performance and integrating. And my final point would be, I think, again, the lag time between the ecosystem and the community generally recognizing that something is a good idea and actually implementing it in practice. It is actually very short in crypto, but it feels a lot longer than I think we would expect. And so the final point I would emphasize, I think, is simply speed is very beneficial. And this is my way of representing what I hope will be the future of Cosmos. Happy to take any questions and would love to talk with anyone afterwards. Thank you. Cool. Please.
What does a16z think is the next compelling business cases to be built on Cosmos Ethereum or Wuollet?
Well, I'll speak for myself personally. The things that I'm most interested, I think, obviously DeFi has had good adoption, but earlier today, Neil was talking a little bit about physical infrastructure networks, and I'm particularly excited there. I think the challenges are quite intensive, but providing real-world services like decentralized transportation or energy or telecom, I think is a very interesting potential path in the future, and hopefully will connect with users a lot more tangibly. At least when I talk with people who are not well immersed in this space, they seem to understand that much more intuitively than a lot of the things like DeFi or NFTs that have been well adopted over the past couple of years. So I think, at least for me personally, that's one area I'm quite excited to see people focus on. Cool. Thank you.